Welcome to God at Work, Stories of Grace and Faith. I'm your host, Chuck Groover, and with last month talking about J.R.R. Tolkien, this month I decided to kind of continue along those lines and talk about C.S. Lewis. So, C.S. Lewis was born Clive Staples Lewis in Belfast, Ireland, on November 29th, 1898. To Albert James Lewis, who was a solicitor at the time, and Florence Augusta Lewis. And they basically were from England, kind of like how Tolkien's family was originally from England, but was born, or at least grew up, outside of England. C.S. Lewis also was born and pretty much grew up outside of England. He grew up in Ireland, where it was, I believe, his grandfather that actually moved the family to Ireland. And when Lewis was around the age of 4, basically after the death of the family dog named Jaxie, he announced that his name was now Jaxie, which he would only answer to that name. Later on, he started to accept Jack, which is pretty much how he was known to both friends and family throughout his life, was as Jack. And actually, after I'd read that, it kind of occurred to me that I believe there were times when I had heard something of C.S. Lewis mentioned, and they would refer to, I believe I've heard to him actually referred to as Jack, before I actually started looking into who C.S. Lewis was for this. Lewis was actually born into a bookish family, so he was surrounded by books at all times, and they had an eclectic taste in reading. Lewis actually recalled, while growing up, there were books in the study, books in the dining room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase in the cistern attic, books of all kinds, and none of them were really off limits to him. He was allowed to read any and all of them he wanted to. And as a child, the books that really caught his interest leaned a lot towards those with the anthropomorphic animals. He fell in love with the Beatrix Potter stories, and he actually often started writing and illustrating his own animal stories, to which later on both him and his brother actually created their own world of Boxen, which was inhabited and actually run by animals, and kind of sounds like the precursor to another set of stories that he had, that he's actually famous for. Then pretty much in 1908, when he was about 10 years old, his mother actually died of cancer, and C.S. Lewis actually became withdrawn and he was actually hit really hard by her death, because his father, who actually never really fully recovered from her passing, kind of also became withdrawn, and C.S. Lewis and his brother actually found themselves becoming pretty much estranged from their father. It was also because of her death that actually led C.S. Lewis to view the God that he encountered in the Bible as if he was not a cruel entity, he was just a vague abstraction. And then by 1912, basically 4 years later, C.S. Lewis just flat out fully rejected Christianity and became an avowed atheist. And so, I mean, it's one of those things, his leaving the faith, because he grew up in, and I'll get to it later on, but he grew up in a very Christian household. His parents were devout Christians and regular members of the Church of Ireland at the time. But like a lot of Christians who don't have that firm faith, when a tragedy like that strikes, that's when a lot of people start questioning their faith. And what C.S. Lewis saw at the time pretty much just led him to atheism. Then basically in 1917, right there around World War I, Lewis entered into Oxford, and soon afterwards joined the Officer Training Corps, in which he was eventually drafted into a cadet battalion for training to head off to war. That was basically his way of joining the army, and he was eventually sent to Somme Valley in France, and upon which he actually arrived on his 19th birthday. And I don't know about you, but that's really a birthday present I probably would not be looking forward to, arriving on the battlefield of a war. And there he experienced trench warfare for the first time. He wasn't even really on the front lines for a year, because on April 15th of 1918, he was wounded when basically a British artillery shell fell short of its target. Basically, he was wounded and 2 others with him were actually killed. And basically, when he was eventually assigned to duty back in England in Andover, and upon his recovery in October of that year, and then basically in December of that year, he was actually demobilized. So he went and basically resumed his studies at Oxford. One thing about Lewis, during his training, he actually the guy he shared a room with was Edward Courtney Francis Moore, and the 2 of them actually became pretty good friends, in which, knowing how wars often go and sometimes the outcome of individuals in wars, they actually made a pact that if either one of them happened to die during the war, the survivor would take care of both their family and the other's family. And unfortunately, Moore was killed in action in 1918, and Lewis, being a man of his word, actually kept his promise. Before they were shipped off, at some point, Moore had actually introduced C.S. Lewis to his mother, who was Jane Moore, and actually a friendship had sprung up between the young C.S. Lewis and the much older Jane. And this relationship was actually important to Lewis when he was recovering from his wounds in the hospital. because I didn't see whether it was mentioned whether she visited him or she just wrote him, but there was some sort of interaction between the two because of that relationship where his father, when he was in the hospital during the war, after being injured, never visited him. That's how basically estranged they were. And pretty much later on, Lewis basically pretty much lived with and cared for her until she was actually hospitalized in the late 1940s. And even after she was hospitalized, then he would go pretty much daily until her death to where she was at to visit her. And often he would actually refer to her as his mother. So, back on track. Having grown up in a devout Christian family, but becoming an atheist basically around the age of 15, this is pretty much where he starts to come back to Christianity. It was his turn back kind of was sparked by the works of George MacDonald, and his return to Christianity actually pretty much came about through really relationship with Tolkien along with a number of other individuals. He met Tolkien for the first time on May of 1926. Also, the book The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton played a significant role as well. And as I mentioned, basically Lewis started to notice that pretty much all of his friends, his acquaintances, basically all those closest around him, and his favorite authors, the books that he was reading at the time that he enjoyed, were all these individuals were in some form or fashion a Christian. And Lewis tried his hardest to resist actually coming to faith. I mean, he noted that he came into Christianity like a prodigal, kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance to escape. I mean, if there's anything that kind of shows how when God works on someone's heart, right there is a good example of God's not going, that basically if God is chasing after you to bring you to faith in Him, He is going to bring you to faith in Him. He actually described his last struggle with Christianity in his book, Surprised by Joy, in which he said, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen," which was a college at Oxford, "night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of Him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England." I mean, knowing what led him away from Christianity, the tragedy that he faced was his mom dying, and basically his father just pretty much, in effect, abandoning him as a 10-year-old child. Having that animosity towards God because of all of that, only to find himself being drawn towards God later on, and pretty much 20 years later. You can see how he could view himself as pretty much being the most dejected and reluctant convert. So basically, he started out really pretty much as then not really a Christian, but as what is called a theist. He believed in God. And then in 1931, Lewis finally converted to Christianity by making a specific commitment to faith. And this happened actually while heading to the zoo with his brother. And much to the disappointment of Tolkien, as mentioned last month, he became a member of the Church of England. And he was actually a devout Anglican, and he upheld pretty much a largely Orthodox Anglican theology. For those of us in the U.S., I believe the Anglican Church is the same or similar to the Episcopal. But even though he was strongly Anglican and held an Orthodox Anglican theology, when you actually read his more Christian writings, which are apologetic in nature, not apologetic as in apologizing, but apologetic in the science or the study of apologetics, which is actually defending our faith. He actually made great efforts to pretty much avoid promoting one denomination over another. So in other words, he pretty much viewed the unity of the universal church, even though we're fragmented into a bunch of different denominations, knowing that a Christian could be a Christian regardless what denomination they are, much like I talked about again last month during the one unscripted. And then once World War II broke out, the Lewises, because C.S. Lewis actually at the time had moved into a house on the outskirts of Oxford called the Kilns, and it was C.S. Lewis, his brother, I believe until she was married, can't remember her name, but it was the sister of basically Jane Moore's daughter. And technically for a while, until she was in the hospital, Jane Moore. So basically, after the outbreak of World War II, the Lewises, actually C.S. Lewis and his brother, took in child evacuees from London and other large cities during all the air raids. Again, sounds like a setting from some of his fictional books. Also, during this time, he actually traveled regularly into London to speak on religious programs that were being broadcast by the BBC, and his speaking on these programs was actually greatly appreciated by civilians and servicemen at the time. It kind of was a light in the darkness, a bit of hope during a bleak time in England's history, Air Chief Marshal Sir Donald Hardman wrote this about the broadcasts. The war, the whole of life, everything tended to seem pointless. We needed many of us, a key to the meaning of the universe. Lewis provided just that. And from what I understand, if you're wanting to, I guess pretty much almost a transcript of the broadcasts, they were actually, his book Mere Christianity is largely composed of those broadcasts. Later in his life, he started corresponding with a Joy Davidman Gresham, who was at the time an American writer of Jewish background, but she was also a convert, a similar convert from atheism. So she was born Jewish. Evidently something in her life led her to atheism, only to then become Christian. And she was actually separated from an alcoholic and abusive husband. And Joy eventually moved to England with her two sons, David and Douglas Gresham. And C.S. Lewis actually viewed her as an agreeable intellectual companion and personal friend. And they basically connected on that intellectual level, and I think it was his brother basically mentioned, or someone close to him had mentioned how even though there wasn't any romantic interest to really begin with, it was all purely intellectual friendship. C.S. Lewis eventually did enter into a civil marriage contract with her so that she would be able to remain in the UK along with her two sons. And then later on, when she was diagnosed with a terminal bone cancer, after a while of her actually complaining about a painful hip, C.S. Lewis and Joy actually sought out a full Christian marriage. After that, Joy's cancer actually soon went into remission, and the couple actually lived together with Lewis's brother, C.S. Lewis's brother, until actually her death in 1960, when the cancer returned. After this, C.S. Lewis wrote the book A Grief Observed, in which he described his bereavement in such a raw and personal fashion that he actually originally had it published under a pseudonym to keep readers from associating the book to him. And the ironic thing is that many of his friends actually, because they didn't even realize he had written this book, recommended the book to C.S. Lewis as a method for dealing with his own grief. And actually his authorship of the book wasn't actually revealed until after his death, and that was actually at the permission of the executors of his estate. So, but pretty much after Joy's death, he continued to raise her two sons. Douglas, which I believe was the older one, like C.S. Lewis and his mother, actually became a Christian. And David, on the other hand, actually turned to his mother's ancestral religion and actually became an Orthodox Jew. And actually went so far as telling Lewis that he was going to become basically one of these people that do the actual sacrificial, that was doing at the time the sacrificial rites to the animals. And then in 1961, C.S. Lewis actually began to suffer from nephritis, which actually resulted in blood poisoning. And this actually caused him to miss the autumn term at Cambridge, which was actually the first time he actually missed a term. And then his health appeared to gradually improve late after that. And according to actually a friend of his, he was fully himself by early 1963. But then on July 15th, C.S. Lewis fell ill and was admitted to the hospital, where he suffered a heart attack the next day and went into a coma. And then the day after that, he woke up, to the surprise of the hospital staff, and he was discharged from the hospital. Although his condition actually continued to worsen, and he was actually diagnosed eventually with end-stage renal failure in mid-November. And then on November 22nd, 1 week to the day before his 65th birthday, he died. Media coverage of C.S. Lewis's death, however, was almost completely overshadowed by the news of the JFK assassination and also the death of the English writer Aldous Huxley. So there was some publication and news about his death, but again, especially with the JFK assassination taking place pretty much, I think it was said that happened like 50 minutes after C.S. Lewis's death. So it was, those two deaths happened pretty much right on top of each other. So as far as how C.S. Lewis goes as a person, he is regarded pretty much by many as one of the most influential Christian apologists of his time. And I know a lot of Christians will read his works, his Christian works, like Mere Christianity, Grief Observed, Surprised by Joy, on miracles. I've read he had a book on the Psalms that I actually had to read for one of my seminary classes. I've also read Mere Christianity and the entire Narnia Chronicles. He was often also called the apostle to the skeptics, which kind of makes sense. I mean, he came to Christianity pretty much as a skeptic, because as a kid, what he saw led him away from the faith, because he viewed it either God was mean, a mean bully, basically, or God was just some abstract thought that didn't exist. So what better than a skeptic to be the one to actually present an argument for Christianity to skeptics? His approach to apologetics was what some would probably call an evidential approach, meaning he used evidence, and pretty much by presenting a reasonable case for Christianity, in which can be seen in some of his more popular works, in which he actually, in those works, would often refute popular objections to Christianity at the time. Some of the most famous arguments he was known... One of the most famous arguments he was known for was what was known as the trilemma, which was to challenge the view that Jesus was pretty much just a great moral teacher but not God. And Lewis argued that Jesus made several implicit claims to divinity that pretty much logically disproved the claim that he was just a good moral teacher but not God. Some of you may be more familiar with the argument as the liar, lunatic, Lord argument. If any of you have listened to Josh McDowell, he is a popular apologist today that regularly will use that argument. He also argued the concept of what is known as a universal morality, or natural law. Basically, that's just that there was a standard of behavior that people expect each other to adhere to, and as such, there must be someone or something behind such a universal set of principles. It's also said that, and a lot of these, his apologetic arguments and stuff, you can also find him pretty much using, not just in his non-fiction works, but also like in the Chronicles of Narnia. He used the trilemma in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when the professor was questioning the older kids about the younger sister, talking about the fanciful world of Narnia, saying that looking at what you know about her, is she lying? Has she gone completely bonkers, or is she telling the truth? And then, but then it's also said that readers of his fiction pretty much are also often unaware that Lewis considered the Christian themes of his works. I mean, again, I've heard a number of times on other podcasts from non-Christian people saying, yeah, I was really big into the Chronicles of Narnia, and then I learned that they were Christian. So, I mean, and then also his apologetics, those books are read and quoted by members of many different Christian denominations. I mean, Baptists, Methodists, probably even Catholics, Presbyterians. I've known people from many different denominations that look at C.S. Lewis and his works and see how great of a theologian and apologist he was. Also, his books actually have inspired many other books. Much of our modern children's literature actually has been influenced by the Chronicles of Narnia, whether for good or bad, as well as some of the adult fantasy authors have testified to actually being influenced by C.S. Lewis's works. And then pretty much in 2013 I believe it was 2013. Yeah, 2013, on the 50th anniversary of his death, C.S. Lewis actually joined some of Britain's greatest writers in being recognized at the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. And among this, the celebration, which included some readings of his works, among other things, a quotation from him was actually inscribed into the floor and it's from one of his addresses. And that is pretty much where I will leave us with for today. And that quote is, "I believe in Christianity, as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." This is Chuck Groover, and that was C.S. Lewis, and that's God at Work.